Social movements are created by people who feel strongly about a cause. These activists want to change or resist injustice they feel. Sociology professor Jeff Langstraat is here to discuss how movements develop and how the difference they have made in society.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, describe how social movements, or what social movements are.
Social movements we generally talk about are groups of people who work to change or resist change in society. Usually when we're referring to social movements, we're talking about people who do some kind of work outside the regular channels of institutional politics.
How do you get your messages out into the public?
First of all, you've got to meet the media. That's the easiest way. In a number of cases, some of the work that I do is focused on people who are creating their own media. So that if, for example, with the gay and lesbian movement in the 1950s, they created their own newspapers and their own news magazines in order to communicate with publics. But part of this is also about establishing relationships with journalists, like yourself, and other folks in order to get messages out to broader publics.
So it's all kind of just getting the message out there, starting by somebody that can make a difference.
It's about communicating messages, yeah. So one of the things that social movement actors are usually involved with doing is trying to produce an alternative vision of reality, trying to frame the world as it exists, or some conditions as they exist, as problems that need to be addressed.
Is it always based on wanting to make a change?
No, there are a number of movements that actually resist social change. So if you think about something like the Ku Klux Klan was involved in trying to resist changes in the racial dynamics of American society, or an organization like the National Organization for Marriage is trying to resist changes that are being brought by gay and lesbian movements in the United States.
Is there certain theories that social movements come from? Is it just put together and just thrown out there?
Well, we've got a lot of theories that talk about how we explain such things as how do people get involved with movements, how do movement actors try and frame their message in order to get people involved, how do they create organizations that work to mobilize resources and get people to show up for a protest or to contribute a check, or those sorts of things. So we've got a lot of theories that try and explain activity, but then movement actors themselves have theories of society and how society operates and how they fit into that and the changes that they can bring about.
Is one technically better than the other, or are they all kind of the same? Do they all contribute equally?
Are you referring to sort of the
theories?
Well, the ones that we have as sociologists studying social movements, we have theories that try and explain different phenomena within that area. But if you think about the people who are involved in social movements, they've got different theories about how society is supposed to operate, what it should look like, what power relationships should look like, and so how they conceptualize power and how they conceptualize the way that society organizes is going to influence the ways that they try and create or resist change.
Is the framing theory you kind of touched on a little bit, how does that impact the society? How does it?
Well, think about it in this way. If we think about the civil rights movement, prior to the 1950s and 60s, one of the things that took place was the idea of separate but equal dominated in society. And if you think about Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision, that was brought about by separate can never be equal. So what framing does is it takes conditions in the real world and tries to explain them. So what civil rights activists were able to do was frame the oppression that African Americans faced as a violation of civil rights. And so in doing it that way, they were also able to convince people, based on the rhetoric of rights and the American values dealing with rights, that there was some kind of wrong that needed to be addressed. And so basically it's about speaking a language that different audiences can hear and figuring out how to make a message that talks about your issue in a way that the different audiences you're looking at will be able to understand it, and that it will appeal to their values.
So you basically want to just go out and frame your issue to publicize it to everybody else, that they understand this is the problem that's happening.
It's basically making something, it's making it hearable.
It's making it hearable. How do you start your own movement, or how do you?
Well, I mean, that's one of the, it's something that's a big question throughout history, because lots of folks have tried and failed. And so, my work focuses on gay and lesbian movements. So for us, we think about this small group of people who in the 1950s in particular were meeting in closed rooms with closed curtains to make sure that the state didn't repress them. And so it was basically communicating, going out and finding people who you thought might agree with you, talking to them, trying to convince them to get involved, trying to convince them there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And so for a large part of this, the early phases of movement emergence are about communication.
How how do you maintain control in all of these movements? Does it ever get just out of control?
Absolutely. You know, that's one of the biggest problems that movement activists face. So that if you take a look at some like the anti-globalization movements that have been taking place, a lot of folks were trying to make, okay, we're going to do nonviolent work, and then sometimes somebody will show up and start breaking windows. So if we think about the civil rights movement, one of the things that they did is had specific training in nonviolent action. So it's about who are you going to get there. But one of the problems that movement actors face is trying to maintain some form of social control among their adherents, and they're not always successful.
Sometimes there's always that one person that's going to break away from the pack. But thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It was very informative and very interesting to listen to.
Glad. Thank you for having me.